Okay, so let's have a frank and candid conversation about self-interest. I'm going to do something. You're going to hate it. And actually, you've accused me of doing it before. I'm going to do it anyway. I can't help myself. Let's say I'm Palestinian in 1996. And presumably, there's supposed to be some ongoing treaty negotiation regarding what's supposed to be a transition into consideration of respecting the rights to self determination of my people. And presumably, there's going to be some third party that's going to engage in some sort of mediation process. Oh, wait a second. Because around the time this was happening, some people that were identified as being under the rubric of the United Kingdom from the north were negotiating with some people that had asserted that they had no intention of accepting any sort of affiliation under some sort of commonwealth structure with the United Kingdom from the south, and they were engaged in some treaty processes as well. And so they go through this treaty process, and in the course of doing this, they make these determinations about what's going to happen. And then, very shortly after this happens, they release a list. This third party negotiator releases a list of organizations that they've identified as terrorists. And lo and behold, a significant number of the political factions that had previously been a part of what had been going on prior to these negotiations are identified as terrorist organizations. They're no longer political factions. They're actually explicitly indicated, demarcated, singled out as being terrorist organizations. And in the meantime, some external interlocutor has come in and, under the auspices of brokering and some sort of mediation, has actually imposed upon us a regime acknowledging the disenfranchisement of a significant number of political parties and organizations within our own territory on its way, hopefully, to becoming a sovereign nation, and instead identified and labeled them as terrorists. And so, the kinds of political activities that we had hoped for being a part of the transformation, including a transformation out of armed struggle, with an understanding that this broker, this mediator, is coming in from a country whose inception, founding, and pride and joy is based upon successfully engaging armed struggle. Against who? Well, I mean, by the way, it happened to be the British, right? And so now all of a sudden, a number of them, and many of these parties are probably parties that I would actually otherwise want to see disbanded in one manner or another, but identifying them as terrorist, having a foreign entity ascribe them the label of terrorist organization, and then say that any efforts we would make, even internally, much less in consideration of our alliances with others who may have their own determination about which kind of a plurality or what kind of a consideration of issue building or platform building, including in international cooperative efforts, may come about, and or if we're internally trying to organize some sort of a parliamentary process regarding an election structure, or maybe some people don't even believe in this kind of constitutional structure or this kind of parliamentarian structure. They have their own understanding of what would be politically viable, and they want to be able to advocate for this in a nonviolent manner within our own society. But some external third party mediator has come in and said, well, these organizations, these political factions, are actually terrorist organizations. And there's a specific reason, I guess, right? Well, why would these specific, well, identify at the time, the primary identification for designating an organization as being a terrorist organization is because not only did they espouse a particular national identity, but they had espoused a national identity that was predicated upon a specific lineage of Marxist Leninism. Now, this is how I understood it 25 years ago. Did you want to say that somebody else is at risk of default because they have not been able to flip or transition the designation and characterization, primary characterization of that which is allowed to be labeled terrorist, so that it can be disenfranchised, dispossessed, and otherwise alienated from a political process as another kind of characteristic? Well, what would you consider to be an appropriate understanding of the contemporary menace of that which qualifies as terrorism these days? See, because my actual experiences with understanding terror, and including the political utility of terror, including the political utility of terror as exercised by state actors or state enabled actors, is not what it used to be. right? Sex terrorism is specifically a contextualization of terrorism, understanding the manipulation of racism and xenophobia, along with paradigms of power that express themselves through violence sexualization. Sex terrorism, to me, is one of the major problems we have, and sex terrorism is paired with cyber terrorism that uses electronic warfare in order to, among other things, impact people's consciousness, in order to try to give them leverage in being able to execute acts of sex terrorism successfully and to cover it up. This is the other vestige of terrorism, to visit terrorism and then to be able to cover it up, including by allowing for it to be recapitulated as something other than actual terrorism. Because if your concern is that we have not actually adequately responded to an appropriate acknowledgement of terror and the political utility of terror, and that and those for whom terror is considered to be an effectively utilized tactical and strategic process, then you are correct. And what we have actually failed to actually adequately address is the specific utilitarianism of state enabled terrorism. Not just executed by the state specifically, but terrorism that is allowed to be accomplished because it is enabled by the state in a form of functionality that, among other things, refuses to hold accountable implicit or explicit acts of political corruption. And the tools and the methodology. It's a time to focus more on the technical and tactical implementation of regimes of terror as opposed to trying to race typify it in order to create another demographic index so that the financial mechanism and the means by which to finance acts of terrorism can be more successfully executed by those who seek to engage it. This is the best I can do. Because if you want to talk about biological terrorism, then you have to talk about electronic warfare. And if you want to actually get to the root of how it is that electronic warfare is promulgated and what the most successful forms of electronic warfare are at this current stage in time, we have to talk about sex terrorism. And we have to talk about it. We're not just talking about pornography, and we're not just talking about the concept of people engaging in public displays of affection that might be offensive to you. We're not even just talking about sexual harassment. We're talking about the enforced and imposed alienation of us from our own bodies, including insofar as we have the right to refuse to engage in sexual activity, and or understanding that refusing to engage in sexual activity and or the manners in which we do engage in sexual activity has been put into a systematology where people will try to sexually exploit us in order to compel us to cede to other kinds of terrorism, including terrorism that engages electronic warfare, biological weapons, and other kinds of efforts to dispossess us of our political rights. I don't want to be disrespectful, but one of the things that has happened in the dialogue on terrorization and terrorism in the last 25 years is it's had a specific, selected, highly loaded racialization, including in manners and from sources that were not racialized prior to the manipulations and machinations of the state engaging themselves so that they could become the enablers of acts of terrorism. And that's where we are now.